Welcome to the Legal Growth Table. I'm Andrew Hutchinson.
And I am Barbara Koenen-Gering.
And together, we are your hosts. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with the people who are actually doing the work of growing law firms from the inside. The ones who know where the real conversations happen, and more importantly, where they don't.
Because everyone in this industry talks about growth. Very few talk honestly about how it actually happens. The politics, the resistance, the things that didn't go to plan. That's what this table is for. So let's get into it. Welcome to another episode of the Legal Growth Table, together with Andrew Hutchinson, my co-host. We are welcoming our very special guest today, Deborah Farone, one of the most respected names in law firm marketing and business development. Deborah spent 14 years as Chief Marketing Officer at Cravath, Swaine and Moore, and before that held the same role at Deborah Farone and Plimpton. She's the founder of Farone Advisors, the author of Best Practices in Law Firm Business Development and Marketing, and her new book, which we are going to talk about today, Breaking Ground, looks at how successful women lawyers build thriving practices. Deborah, welcome to the Legal Growth Table.
Oh, Barbara, it's so nice to be here with you and Andrew.
So let's dive straight into it. You were actually, this interesting fact, the very first person hired to build a marketing function at Cravath, a firm that had never had one before. So where did this start and what did you have to invent when you arrived at this firm? I'm really intrigued to know.
Well, I had come from Deborah Farone and Plimpton, where I was also the CMO. And so I thought I knew enough about legal marketing to help Cravath, but the interesting thing is each firm really is so different. And so I learned that quickly. It's an amazing firm with brilliant people, but they didn't have a business development function or marketing communications. And so I do believe, and I tell my clients this, you have to lay the primary plumbing first. So after doing that, after establishing those departments, then we broke it up into business analysis, where people had Bloomberg terminals and were able to keep a watch on keywords and various metrics. We were also able to do more in the marketing communications area, do newsletters, do pieces that would go out to clients, database work, so the whole shebang, but quite clearly based on the foundation of having a really good structure to start with.
Did they have a perspective as you were coming in? Because I think even today, as we think about people who are sat in seat, the world is changing, and part of that change as a first chair is actually educating the partnership on what that change is going to look like, what it means for them, but what it also means for the team. How much quote unquote selling did you have to do to the partnerships to get some of that infrastructure in place?
Absolutely. Great question. A lot. It's great training for anything else in life. They would ask the right questions. They wanted to know about ROI. They wanted to know about what other industries were doing this. They wanted to know sometimes what other firms were doing. But at Cravath, we weren't as concerned with other firms as much as we were what is right for this particular firm. And so you do have to ask for staff and you do have to build a business case for it. They did ask all of those questions, but as a marketer, hopefully you've thought the answers out in advance and you're ready to move ahead. But they were, smart and tough, as you could imagine. And so it wasn't, let's just build this and let's build that. It was, how am I going to substantiate building this? And very often it meant meeting with investment banks and finding out what kind of departments they had, or meeting with friends at insurance companies or even luxury marketing kinds of firms to see what they recommended.
Yeah, bring some benchmarking from other industries to the table to show what could be possible, potentially.
Absolutely, because my feeling is, and still today, we don't have all the answers in law firms. We're still on that growth mode, and we can all become much better. but I felt like, let me keep an open mind and learn what other businesses are doing and how they handle these problems or situations.
Interesting. And I think there is still to date a lot that can be learned from other industries if we were a little bit more open, I suppose, to taking some of that, lift through experience through to the law firms as well. I think the main thing that we hear back all the time when we speak on this podcast as well is every firm is so unique and every firm is so different. But when we hear the things across the board, we tend to say, well, they're really quite similar. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. I do agree. I mean, through your work, having worked with so many wonderful firms, that there are certain themes that you hear. Partnerships are interesting animals. They all have their own quirks, but yet the money for the most part is coming out of their pockets, so they don't spend freely, which I understand. They tend to work by precedent. They'll say, if this has worked at another firm, maybe we'll try it, which is not necessarily the way good marketing is done. You want to differentiate yourself. So there are certain issues that you see crop up time and time again within firms, and yet they all have their own culture. They all started differently. They all hire laterals differently. Their practice areas are different. So in many ways, they are different, but have kind of the same type of DNA.
Yeah. So let's turn to your book for a moment, because first of all, congratulations on the launch of your new book. I read it when I was on my holiday, and it was a great book to read. Thank you so much. I think it was absolutely incredible. The content was very, very interesting, and mostly so what really sort of like stood out for me were the interviews that you've had with, if I get it right, over 60 successful women lawyers, right?
Yes.
When you've gone through these interviews and you've spoken to so many individuals, what were the themes that sort of like stood out for you instantly that you wanted to bring back into your book?
That's a great question. There were definitely three findings that came out of it. These women were ultra successful, and I wanted to find out why and what made them successful. I think the first was that they had a very long-term perspective on building relationships. They knew that it wasn't going to be something that happened overnight, but that if they stayed in touch with people and they were empathetic towards them and provided them with value in those relationships, something would happen. So they had a very long-term perspective. I think the second thing that came out of it, and you touched on it before about firms being different, people are so different, that I think because people are idiosyncratic, some of them might want to market in one way, some in another way. And I give the example all the time of Annalisa Reale at Chiamenti, who loves taking her potential clients and existing clients to the opera. She loves music. She was a classical musician. She enjoys going to the opera, and her clients see that, and she'll invite them to a short opera to bring their family and then to have a nice dinner afterwards in Milan. And so I think people find their own ways of marketing. And as a marketer, from the lessons that I think were given to me, I would say it's really very important to understand that different people are going to market in different ways, and you have to support that. So that was the second. And I think the third was trust. The idea that trust is just so important to be built, and that's why people get hired. And trust seems to be, from all the studies that I've read, a combination of the ability to really do great work and have great logic in how you do the work, and it's empathy as well, and it's authenticity. So I think those three things are really important to train lawyers on, to get them to be empathetic, to get them to realize they can be authentically who they are, and also to constantly reinforce their work, that they can continue to build their skills over years.
You talked in the first one about value. So I talk about creating a value exchange, which is sort of similar to what you were talking about. I think sometimes lawyers generally get lost in the idea that value is what I charge for. In the people that you were talking to across those 60 women, what was value to them? What were the sorts of things that they were doing to create value over and above doing the job, so to speak?
It's a great point. I think mainly they were taking an approach where they were trying to support these clients. So they were asking the right questions. They were finding out, what was their situation like at work and how could they help? Who were they reporting to and what were the tough spots? Who reported to them and how they could help with training them. So I think that empathy piece really helped with adding value. They were really listening. And I think all of us are guilty at some time or another of not listening, but these women were very good at that. And I think they were able to draw out what clients really needed and then offer support. So very often it was the support of being a friend. Other time it was the support of saying, this is how I handled a childcare issue. But I think it was the mindset shift that made a difference.
Yeah, it's the emotional intelligence, I suppose, that is potentially a little bit more developed on that side as well when considering sort of like business conversations and talking about not commercials, but actually how can I be of value in a different way. And Andrew and I, we speak a lot about rainmaking because that still seems to be a term that lives within many different law firms across the world. And there has also been a mention of rainmaking in your book, obviously. How would you see rainmaking in the context of law firm growth? Because in our view, it might have both sort of like a positive as well as a negative connotation, because rainmaking doesn't always necessarily bring the best out of a firm's culture or shape the firm's culture in a way that you may not want it to be. So it's always a very interesting discussion. And how have you experienced this from the women actually that you've interviewed? And is the rainmaking also very different from women to men? As a part two of my question, but very much, okay, rainmaking in principle, what is your view on that in terms of law firm growth?
Well, I think we're finding and seeing all the time that compensation is such a basic tenet of how you're going to get people to both work together and to do rainmaking. And so if you have an eat what you kill environment, you're going to have a tougher time with your laterals, getting them integrated and getting them to rainmake. So I think the first question is always going to be compensation, and then it's going to be the culture and how the culture warms things up. And I did find that culture is a huge differentiator in how people develop business. If a lawyer knows what's going on in different practice areas and there's a culture of speaking with one another, even at a very large firm or an international firm, they're going to be more apt to develop business and also bring in their partners. But that first thing is compensation. The second thing I guess I really heard a lot of, and I see this in my own practice, in that you really need to start early with associates. You can't wait until someone becomes a partner to train them. I mean, that's a disaster, because what happens then is they have spent 7 years of losing contacts, not having the chance to really develop a network and a circle of friends and a circle of connections. And so I think that can happen. And also they develop bad habits. They're not going out to lunch. They're not inviting people to events. They're not thinking who should come to this firm, seminar that we're doing. So there are a number of reasons you've just got to start early. And I think the firms that are really successful are putting in creative programs like the programs that you two have innovated on. I think, you need to be able to gather people's attention early on that this is something that really matters. And the difference between men and women, I think women have to look at and have looked at non-traditional ways of marketing, because going out to drinks or going to play golf, although that might work for some women, I think the women who have really excelled have done different kinds of things. They've created their own types of seminars, or they just develop it in a different way. And those are the ones that I've seen do really well.
Yeah, and I've seen that it stood out from your book as well, the many different examples that you've given about from the women that you've spoken with, how they actually rainmake and how they go about, winning business and doing the networking that really works for them. And I think that's what you said earlier in this conversation as well. It's not everyone is the same, right? Everyone has their own approach, their own way of it's going to work for them. And just an interesting thought here as to sort of like complement what you've just said, how the difference between men and women are as well. I spoke with my sister this week, who organized a huge conference for it was a pharma conference essentially in Athens, and she brought together lots of different pharmaceutical companies as well as pharma companies in the German region who offer sort of like online pharmacy, which is still a new thing. And she was surrounded by mostly men. It's still a male-dominated environment. So she said it's about 80% men and 20% women. And then there was the drinks reception, and it was quite warm. So the men basically put their swimming shorts on and went in the pool, and they had their discussions in the pool over a beer. And she was like, it never in my mind would I go in my bathing suit and join them for a drink. And I was like, no, of course I get you. Like, I wouldn't do that either. And she was like, it actually limited me from the experience of networking with people, my peers, who happened to then be men. So she felt she was missing out on an opportunity, which, yeah, I mean, it's just interesting how you find your own ways of sort of like building networks and opportunities and moments where you can have that interaction.
Absolutely. No, it's true. You kind of hear from so many women that they have felt excluded, whether it was, I like your example. I like the having to get into a bathing suit to network example. But also, very often men will go to certain sport games that women aren't interested in. And do you fake it and go ahead? I don't think so. I don't think you need to. I think you find your own, activities, but it does question, are you being excluded or not? And my feeling is, yes, I hope law firms change. I hope society changes. But in the meantime, at least I want to help people who want to be helped and let them take control over their own careers, because I can't change law firms. But I can help individual lawyers. So I figured, let me do that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And authenticity that you alluded to earlier is obviously that's everything, right? That's the main part, which I know, Andrew, you see in pure sales as well.
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting, right? So I have very different, right? The challenges that women face in terms of networking is very different to my world, right? I live in a very privileged existence, but 70% arguably of the people that I sell to are women. And so I've had to go in the other direction. And it's interesting, when I interview salespeople, that is one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is, do you have the capacity is the wrong word, but do you have the breadth of experience and the breadth of not imagination, but to be able to go and put yourself in a room with 50 women as a man and have a conversation and network and build rapport, right? And so very different, but like I understand that challenge. And one of the things that I recognize is that there is a huge personality piece to this. So in my industry, there are legal sales people who are very good because they have a black book of CIOs of a certain age, probably white males. People will shoot me for saying this on a podcast, but like that is the reality, right? And they walk into a new company and they pull up the black book and they say, okay, I'm just gonna, go talk to these people. That doesn't mean that they're very good at selling necessarily. And so my question to you, Deborah, would be that whole personality piece. Mm-hmm. You interviewed a collection of people who probably have the personality traits to actually step out of their comfort zone and figure out their own journey. But more often than not, you look at partners, and these tend to be the people who aren't rainmakers. They don't have that personality trait. And so when you look across the industry, lots of people are trying to, deliver paint by numbers to a lawyer that says, if you do these 5 things every week, you'll suddenly become a rainmaker. Like, talk about what you're seeing in that regard, particularly as it becomes more challenging to win business.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a perfect system that worked for everyone? But there isn't. I don't know if I spoke about this earlier, but there's something called the trust triangle. And the trust triangle really was done for banking, and it was done by 2 Harvard researchers who are just absolutely brilliant, Anne Morris and Francis Fry. And what they have said, and I think this is so true when you're developing relationships, whether it's with clients, whether it's with your own staff, that trust and building these relationships really has 3 elements. The first is the ability to do what you do and the logic behind it. Are you very proficient? And these women, I think to a person, were constantly learning, constantly improving, and keeping their eyes open for new ideas. I mean, by nature, I think they're curious people, but they were constantly improving at their work. And then there's empathy. There's really caring about a client and really caring about someone and understanding what it is that they're going through and understanding the pressures of their profession. And then there's authenticity. Do I believe that person is really who they are, or are they putting on an act? And people sense that. And that, these 2 researchers came up with this trust triangle to say, you really need all 3 in order to engage someone and have them trust you. And I think very often something is missing with lawyers. Most of them probably are good at what they do and have that logic piece, but they might not be empathetic. They might not be really listening. They might just want to sell, which is not a good thing. Or they might not have that authenticity. They might be so afraid of being themselves that comes across. And so I think you need those 3 things in order to connect. And I think great rainmakers usually have them.
How do you think building it? Because I think you're right. That's particularly when you think about buying legal services, right? That is so important. You are buying a person. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, everybody who you are sitting at the table to potentially win this business, they have the skills, but maybe they don't have some of those elements that you've just talked about. The other piece that sits alongside that for me is the commerciality, right? So when we think about this changing world that we exist in, more procurement, more oversight from boards, wanting to make sure that diligence is being done in the right way on the law firms that are being selected. That's kind of another piece to the puzzle, right? Because I think you can be a great rainmaker and you can get your foot in the door and you can get to the final selection. But do you have the skills, the ability to sell a commercial model that might be non-traditional? Do you have the commercial skills to counter objections that are being presented through their conversations with other competitors, right, of yours? And for me, I think that's the developing piece. Yes, I totally agree with that what you just described. But how do you see that commercial element developing in the people that you're working with?
I think that's a great and important point, because I think people do need to be trained about how to handle objections. And I think this idea of sales training or business development training is so vital, obviously, or I wouldn't do it. I mean, I speak at all kinds of firms on this topic, but I think one of the things people can do prior to going into a sales situation is think about what those objections are up front before they're even raised, and hopefully spend the time in advance of a pitch to really think about that and to think about how they would respond if they have the proper response, if it's true and honest, and be able to address those things even before they're asked. So I might say that someone's not going to hire me because of either my location. Well, I could say that I'm available via Zoom, and also I'll visit them. I'll put it in my contract that I'll visit them once a month or whatever it is. They might not want to hire me because of my price, but I'll tell them I have, 3 decades of experience and I've worked with thousands of partners. So you think about what those objections are in advance and address them before they're even raised. But that comes from being trained on how to develop business, or by being mentored if you're lucky enough to have a mentor who will do that with you. But I think you're right. And it's harder when you're selling something that's not a parity product, just like the firm next door.
Yeah. Do you think you'll see, well, one of the things that I wonder is whether you'll start to see more sales professionals. So, and I'm intentionally differentiating from BD people, right? Because a lot of what you see today in law firms is business development people who are focused on, typically they're supporting actors, right? So they're helping out in the background. And I was talking to a CKO recently who said, I think we might start to see sales professionals, so that bit that you've just described, because that what you've just described takes time. You have to consciously sit and think about it. And not every partner is going to prioritize that in the context of all the other things that they're trying to do. Do you see a world where actually we will see sales professionals coming in, not to take away from the partner, but to be that sales coordinator, if you like? So they're helping the partner navigate through the commercial conversations, through the objections, so that the partner can roll into a meeting and be the expert, be the shining light in the room. And then you've got somewhere that's going to catch you, someone who's going to catch you when those questions come up.
I do think we are seeing more of that at firms. For the most part, they're not like the AmLaw 10 firms, but they might be lower down. And I'm not opposed to it. I think it's fine. I think it might in situations be the perfect solution, but I still think lawyers need to be trained, because what's going to happen is they're going to get the client, as you said, and there still might be objections. I think you're constantly in the mode where you have to be able to provide answers to those clients, not necessarily to sell, but to be able to provide those answers to clients. So I still think they're going to need training, even if they have someone selling themselves, setting up the meetings, even convincing, the potential client to hire them. I still think they need that training and that coaching.
I think even more so now that AI is playing a bigger role, right? Because the focus, I think, is much more on not only just your technical skills as a lawyer, which has been emphasized for, all that time, essentially. And now I think we slowly see more of a shift to other essential skills, many of that you've mentioned in this conversation, but that firms start to shift to actually make investments into developing those skills within their lawyers, because they see that the client demands are also changing. And with those demands changing, ultimately, the role of a lawyer is going to become, in my view at least, quite a different one from the traditional lawyer that we've worked with for all the time. Would you agree?
Yes, no, I do agree. I think, AI is it's part of what our futures are going to hold. And so partners also need to be familiar with it enough and to know what it can do to help them, and know how it's going to impact the work in order to sell it. I also think, though, and I've spoken to a number of GCs recently who have said they're very interested in AI, obviously, for operating their departments. They wish that their firms would work with them. And so that's such a great opportunity for firms to say, look, we're trying to innovate at the same time, but let's have a conversation with you about what we're learning or how we can help you. I think those are the firms that are really going to do well with this.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I got exactly the same feedback. We were at Legal Tech Talk conference last week, and I moderated a roundtable discussion with Ano Sherman's AI innovation team, and we had quite a good number of in-house counsel around the table. And the sentiment across the room was exactly what you said. It's we want to work with our law firms to develop tooling that can help us do things more efficiently. But the human in the loop is still the lawyer at the law firm that we like to work with. So there is still a role for lawyers even in the future. But one of the most important things is have that relationship with the firms and with the lawyers in the firm. So the skill building around it and how you would advise your clients in the context of AI and technological workflows and establishing, process, etc., that's going to help them, also brings a very different dynamic, not only to the relationships, but also to the output of the work, for sure. So many skills that are all of a sudden much more needed than a couple of years ago.
Absolutely. And being able to translate that for a client, I think, is key.
Yeah.
It's so funny though, because in my world, when a client says to me, "Hey, I would love to collaborate with you on this thing," the very next thing that comes out of my mouth is, "When can we meet? When can we do it? When can we start?" And you have both existed in law firms, and you have sat in the multiple panels over decades where GCs have said the same exact thing every year. We want you to collaborate with us. We want you to talk to us. And for whatever reason, well, we know the reason, law firms don't jump on those things. How do we change that culture? How do we get partners to understand the value of truly partnering with their clients? Because there is so much value, not just to them, but to the ecosystem at large.
I think in a way it's relatively simple, because some of the feedback in another GC roundtable discussion was, like most of the GCs in that table, it wasn't at the Legal Tech conference, but it was before then. They all said unanimously, "I've never had my law firm ask me what my tech stack actually looks like." It's about asking questions, and to your point earlier, listening. It's as simple as that. You'll find out, and then very soon you'll have a conversation about, okay, how can we help you? It's ignorant to think that they don't have access to the same AI tools as you do. Everyone does nowadays. So listen, understand, try to see where there is a segue into potentially making things better for them, helping them out, making improvements, building workflows together, etc.
I think these are such important questions, whether it's AI or anything else. I have a list, and anyone can ask me for it, and I'll give it to them, of 20 questions, and they're also in the book, I think, as well, that you should be able to know the answers to for your clients. And of course, you should know what their technology issues are, when you're talking about a law firm and what's going on at the client. You need to know what a legal department is like. But very often people don't even understand that, this GC reports into whomever, or who reports into them. It's much more transactional, and it really can't be anymore, not if you want to hold on to a client. And one of the best examples I've heard for many years, I've thought about this one, was that there was a partner at one of the firms that I worked with who had a great relationship with his in-house counsel at a big bank. And he actually helped the in-house counsel restructure his department. He helped him think out who should report to whom and how to handle workflow. And that client was so thrilled. They gave additional work to the firm. They stayed with the firm for a long, long time. And it was a basic kind of, I can help you manage the system because I'm on the outside and I can give you some advice. Why not do those small things for clients that are really going to help them? Because you have competition and you want to keep the client, do what the client really needs.
Well, then it can be simpler than that too, right? So I have a friend who was an equity partner of a West Coast firm, and he talks about going and spending time on site with his clients. Now, he had a variety of clients, but one of his clients was an institutional daycare company. So they had daycare centers all over the place. And he went and sat in the daycare centers, and he picked 5, and he sat there for a day, and he listened and he observed what was going on. And I said, well, that's great, but what did you do with what you learned? And he said, look, there were many things that I did, but he said the number one thing that I figured out was how the leaders of those daycare centers communicated with the parents, but also communicated up within the organizational structure. So when I gave legal advice, I was able to give it in a way that they could consume very quickly. I wasn't giving them, the law says blah, blah, blah. I was taking what I knew as a lawyer and I was delivering it to them in a way that was consumable. And even those little things, that's such a huge thing for general counsel, right? If I can take my advice and pass it straight to the chief exec, that's great. If I've got to rewrite it, I don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
True. Well, I know this is the worst part of the session, but I'll have to say we've come to an end. We are at time, and it was really absolutely wonderful to have you at our table. Deborah, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Again, huge congratulations on launching your book, Breaking Ground. I've read it with great interest, and I would highly recommend anyone listening. We will drop the links in the episode as well. But thank you, Deborah, for joining us.
Oh, Barbara and Andrew, it's been my pleasure.
If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone in your firm who needs to hear it.
You can find us on Spotify and YouTube, and follow along on LinkedIn, where we keep the conversation going between episodes.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.